Media bias. Alright, I want to have a little say about media bias here. Now, first off, let's start with a basic understanding of bias. Bias means a preference to one thing over another. Alright, having had said that, we all have bias. You have bias, I have bias. My bias, I'm a Christian. My bias, I'm conservative. My bias, I believe in marriage, etc., etc., etc. I have bias. Now, our biases are formed by any number of reasons. We are formed by our upbringing, our encounters in our lifetime, our education, what our teachers have taught us, any number of sources. Now, let's consider the media. What is the media? The media is made up of reporters, editors, and owners. The media is full of people, and all these people carry with them individual bias. Now, let's look at how a reporter collects a story. You see a picture on the screen. You see a situation occur. What you see is a cop beating a man on the ground who happens to be black. Now, based on your bias, you can see it any number of ways. If you're a black man, you might assume that he's beating on him because he's black. It's a racist thing. If you're a victim of crime or have been a victim of crime, you would see it as a police officer taking down a criminal. If you're a police officer, you might see it the same way. If you are a anti-violence advocate, you would see it as a sign of society's violence. If you're a survivalist or a separatist, you might see it as an example of government oppression. Any number of ways could come about in which a reporter might see that same information and come to a conclusion that may well be far from the truth. The truth is simply what it is. You know, you see an individual, there's a conflict, there's a person, a police officer, a person who is a police officer, striking a person on the ground. The police officer is of one race, the other person is of whatever race that is. That's the truth. You can extrapolate further off of that, but the truth is actually rather boring. It doesn't sell. Most media sources know that the truth doesn't sell. It's not fancy, it's not flashy, it doesn't have key buzzwords. I mean, who's going to read a story in the paper saying, police officer struck a man on the ground during an arrest? That's not particularly driving. But let's say you couch in the phrase, white cop beats black man. Well, guess what? You now have a whole segment of population that's going to watch this. Civil rights groups are going to show up. It's going to be like Reverend Sharpton will be on TV within 5 seconds. Jesse Jackson's going to be there, etc. Al Sharpton will be there. Now, what's the deal with this? Well, what happens is the news reporter sees a story. He writes it in the context of his personal bias because he can't do otherwise. It's nearly impossible for anyone to be truly neutral. So, what happens is he takes this already biased story to an editor. Now, the editor has a bias too. The editor has his personal bias, political whatever, and his focus, and what ends up happening is he changes the story slightly to match his personal bias. Now, his personal bias is also altered by what he thinks the audience's bias is and what he thinks the audience wants to hear. So, the audience wants to hear or see something. What's going to happen is the editor is going to couch the story in a framework that's going to make that audience responsive to the story, come and want to listen to it. Then the media source, the owners, decide where they're going to put this story. And that's based on their own bias. If they have contributors or friends of a political party that might be made look bad because of this story, they're more likely to bury it. or decide that it doesn't need to be shown. Or to insist that the editor changes a story to match a more friendly and, quote, fair way of looking at the story. Any number of tools can be used to that effect. So the end result is you have a media that is inherently biased to one end or another. Now here's a question. Can you have an objective, true reporting of the news? No, you can't. To assume a news source can provide a complete, unbiased source of information, any news source, is to assume that news source reports every story that happens everywhere, at any time, from all possible perspectives. That's impossible. It is utterly impossible. They select these stories based on what they think their audience wants to hear, what they think is important, and other stories that they don't feel are as important are ignored. This is where the media and the internet come into play. The internet comes into play because it picks up stories that are special interest stories. Christian groups on the internet will collect stories that are of Christian interest. Muslim groups will collect stories that are of Muslim interest, and so on. The ultimate bottom line is that they all have bias, and all because a media source is biased does not mean that the story is illegitimate or inaccurate. And it's important to keep your mind open to all media sources and any information it puts forward, and not simply say, well, that's a biased source, so you can't use that source. So Fox News, that's a biased source. Ignore them. No, you have to listen to them, because the information may well be very accurate, just be of interest to a different political group than yourself. Thank you. Have a very good day, and God bless.